Okay. Yeah, it is always risky giving the lawyer the last word because they're not known for brevity. While I was asked about robots, and I was actually somewhat relieved when I was looking around trying to find what's the canonical definition of a robot to find out that there wasn't one, that there are many definitions of robots, which I felt gave me some license because rather than considering issues that are particularly related to embedding software in things that we might think of as robots, right? Some mechanical thing that is moving around. I actually think from the perspective of law, what's more interesting is thinking about the way in which we are externalizing sensing and externalizing sense-making and some of the implications of that externalization or kind of bleeding, augmentation, enhancement, and how law thinks about that and what that might also mean for some of our kind of ethical considerations, normative considerations. So I took some license, and hopefully you'll be OK with that. So I wanted to start with, this is a picture from, I want to say 2006, from Computers, Freedom, and Privacy. And on the one hand, you see Steve Mann, and he was on stage discussing surveillance. And of course, his difficulty in coming across the border from Canada into the US with all of the various electronic devices that he had attached to his body. And in the other corner is Jennifer Stoddard, who was quoted as an attendee from Quebec, but was in fact Canada's privacy commissioner at the time. And he was up on stage talking about the way in which he was wearing these technical enhancements that were allowing him to record visual and oral. And she was in the audience and stood up and said, you know, that's illegal here. You can't photograph people without their consent and their knowledge. And ensued this very interesting conversation. He, of course, said, well, these are assistive devices. Right? He said that I have cognitive deficits, that my memory isn't very good. And just like you are allowed to wear a hearing aid or eyeglasses, I wear these things to help me through my life. In which her jaw dropped, you might imagine. And you know, this idea that he had a poor memory and he was trying to enhance his physical capacity is one that rings true for somebody like me who is watching my memory and my vision decline. Yet, we know that there are ways in which technology, the use of technology to enhance our senses, when it's coupled with storage and computation, isn't just an enhancement, right? It is something different. This is an image. Is Ken still here? Ken Goldberg? So Ken Goldberg did this project Demonstrate a few years later. And this was a camera that was installed high up on a building on Sproul Plaza to commemorate the free speech movement. And you could operate this camera from anywhere in the world as long as you logged in with an email address. And you could use it to take up to 5 images a day that were posted to the site and which people could comment upon. Now, when we think about a concept like privacy, it's interesting. This was in a public place. And in the US, in part because we have a deep commitment to freedom of expression, and that includes generally your right to collect information that's essential to that freedom of expression. You can think about particularly reporters and their ability to photograph and record things that are happening in public places. However, normally when we think about a public place, it is a place where we're actually able to assess the place, right? That a public place like Sproul Plaza, in the middle of the night versus the middle of the afternoon, might feel like very different places in ways that are meaningful if you're thinking about privacy, and you might moderate your behavior in different ways. And here, the introduction of technology destroyed many of the things that one needs to form expectations, right? So one, it destroyed our ability to assess place. It turned out that you could be in Sproul Plaza and in Estonia, where there was someone taking photos. It destroyed our understanding, our ability to assess audience, right? And we know that this is true of technology. Communication technology often has this capacity of bridging distances and masking certain audiences. There was a lack of mutuality. Typically, when we think about limitations of privacy in public places, yes, I might not be able to control who sees me, but I might actually take some sort of behavior to limit what they see. I'd moderate my own behavior. My husband's a photographer, and if you try to take pictures of people in public places, often they have different ideas about whether or not that's okay, regardless of what the law might say, right? So the distance, the inability to understand who the audience was or to physically interact with them meant that some of the self-help that we use on a standard basis to protect our privacy in public places disappeared. We also know that all of a sudden the temporal dimension of being in a place, right, which we typically experience as a relatively ephemeral act, right? I walk through Sproul Plaza many times a day. I don't actually expect that there's a recording of that forevermore, right? I don't leave little footprints across that concrete, right, unless it's wet. And so our understanding of what it means to be present, in fact, was changed. And then we also know that by aggregating all those little bits of data, right, it turned out there was one woman who came to Sproul Plaza and lied down on the fountain every day and read, I think it was The Crying of Lot 49. And there were pictures taken of her that we had this mosaic, this whole picture of her life, and all of a sudden it wasn't just kind of a discrete ephemeral moment. We had this mosaic which told us a lot more about who she was and what she did. Now, most importantly, it made it really, really difficult to comprehend or to create an expectation for that place that might shape one's behavior in relation to privacy. The law, interestingly, has different understandings when whether both public law and private law in the US, when we think about visual versus oral enhancements. And so while there have been, as you might be aware, some very serious private concerns about the introduction of Google Glass, right? Clearly Jennifer Stoddard's concern with enhanced vision is one that's been shared. Many people seem to be concerned about people enhancing their vision, particularly not that they can see better per se, right, with more acuity, but that they can record what they see, right? So that difference between recording, as I like to say, a little recording means a lot. It means a lot both legally, and then it means that there's something to be accessed later on. And it also means a lot, it turns out, for people. People seem really concerned about the violations of context that recording can create, right? All of a sudden, you may see me, but then you're going to be able to share that later on. Someone else will be able to see me, or you can repurpose that image of me in some way that takes my activities out of context and creates some sort of dignitary harm. Anybody familiar with this picture? We have some Doctor Who fans in the audience. So who are these people, or non-people? The Oods, right? So the Oods are really interesting to me in that early on in the series, it appears that they actually carry their brains around in their hands. Remember this? And I found that really interesting, this idea that we were externalizing our brain. But as you move forward in the story, it actually turns out that those really are merely a piece of some kind of remotely configuring network of brains that are all connected to this big Ood brain, right? And so what's interesting in this, and my husband is always talking about the fact that he's outsourced his brain to Google, right? And at some level, right, the way in which we interact with search engines and all of these tools that allow us to retrieve information is creating physical manifestations of the way in which we process information, right? For me, very discursively, I have to say, not in the good way, and the way in which we can't find the things that are on our desktop. But we have all of this exposure of stuff that we traditionally think about as going on in here, right? Or at least within our physical space. Even if I'm searching for information, it was in the confines of places that I normally think of as private. And so we have this kind of externalization of our thinking. And we, as a legal matter with respect to the government, once we disclose information to third parties, under the Fourth Amendment of the US Constitution, we are considered to have abandoned it, right? It's like you've abandoned your thoughts. Or to assume the risk that somebody else is going to turn that information over. Now, that has some pretty profound implications when you think about all the turning over you're doing to Google on a daily basis. And there are little pockets where we've decided that that particular idea that everything that we're doing when we're interacting with an entity as what they consider to be a business record under the Fourth Amendment, in which you lose an interest, your reasonable expectation of privacy evaporates because you've disclosed it to some third party. We have, under state law, protections for library records. California is the first state to adopt a general reader privacy law, which was in part pushed forward by Google Books. And we have some other sectoral laws because Congress said, wow, you might have interpreted the Fourth Amendment that way, but we actually want people to entrust some of their information to third parties like banks and doctors and things. We don't think they should store that all under the bed lest they lose their privacy. But as a general matter, outsourcing some of our cognitive processing, particularly if it's to devices or systems that we don't have ownership over or physical control, where those things are in the cloud or on somebody else's service or mushed together with other people's thinking, raises some really interesting challenges for the way in which our legal protections are shaped with respect to privacy. WALL-E. So I really like this one because we have this story of the robots. And initially, in the tale, the humans in the story perceive the robots in the narrow sense, right? These very mechanical embodiments of robotness as the risk or the threat. And it turns out, as you know, that the real threat is the machine that they're in, which is this robot of an environment, right? It's this complex network of embedded sensors and actuators. And it's this thing that's been studying them and watching them all this time that takes over and is actually the threat, not just to their privacy, because clearly they don't have any, but to their flourishing, right? To their whole sense of what it means to be human. And today, we know this conference is focused on robots, but to me, it seems that one of the things in the kind of conceptually, thinking about the robots as something that we interact with or something that we inhabit is possibly one interesting thing to consider. And I've been working on things like smart grids, sensor networks within the homes, but also thinking about the way in which we're embedding sensors in other environments, such as cars, that we traditionally think of as containers, right, as structural barriers that protect our privacy. Right, that the man's castle, the woman's castle, home, prison, I don't know, it depends on how you want to think about it. Right? But right, the idea that our castle, our home, is this place where we're allowed to engage in intimate acts. We're allowed to supposedly be able to retreat from society, to develop our own thoughts. So it's part of being a good participant in the democracy. And all of a sudden, these environments are being embedded with sensors, computation, they're being networked, and information is leaking out of them, both by design, in that the sensors, for example, our new smart meters are going to be spewing information about our energy consumption in near real time. And from the energy signals of your appliances, we can tell what you're doing in your home. But also unintentionally, in that often those networks are being designed with relatively little concern for the security properties of the systems. And so we find, you could take a recent example, the Google Wi-Fi example, where Google got in trouble for sniffing Wi-Fi traffic between people's computers and their Wi-Fi base stations. Well, why was Google able to do that? Because the traffic wasn't encrypted by default between the computer and the base station. And we could have made sure that that information wasn't available to be sniffed. But the way in which we are rolling out these systems make activities that are happening in the privacy of our homes more publicly available. Now, why might this matter? Well, as I mentioned, the minute something becomes a business record outside the home, your control over it, the ability of the government to access it, to go back to Greg's suggestion that we focus a little bit on the government, changes. In the US, the protections are much weaker once they are considered the records of a business rather than the records of your life, despite the fact that they remain recordings about your activities. But it also means that the ability of third parties, whether it's a private litigant or the company to whom you're turning them over, is much more able to do what they will with that information, raising some additional questions. So I wanted to close with perhaps my favorite robot movie of all time. And this is The Iron Giant. And it isn't really a privacy story, but I think there's some privacy thing in it. Why is it my favorite? Well, the robot, he brings this young boy around from being somebody who's really excited to have a gun and glorifying violence. And in this particular scene, the robot, who's recently come to Earth or reawakened or whatever, sees a deer in an opening, very Bambi-esque opening, and the deer, as in Bambi, is shot. And the robot reacts in horror, and the boy actually, as he witnesses the robot witnessing this act, all of a sudden understands the profound violence that's being done. And he has this whole kind of reawakening over the course of the movie, but you can kind of see it start right there. And one of the interesting things that I take away from this is there's this opportunity, perhaps, to use some of the ways in which we are externalizing or enhancing or augmenting to not only augment our own, but also to think about the ways in which we build empathy. And I think there's a privacy implication, as I said here. But so for me, like the most profound application of Google Glass would actually, when I talk to my son and say, could you see that through their eyes, right, would actually do that for us, right? And there are some privacy implications in being able to share in other people's vision or to share in other people's thinking. But I think that there might be some real communal benefit in thinking about the way in which we do that in a privacy protective way, right? It would be neither surveillance or surveillance or even coveillance. Maybe people who do visioning have a word for it, but I don't know. Anyway, thank you.